I'm Maren Ekstrom from the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy, Budapest. Our guest today is Professor Thomas Morgan from the College of Saint Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, USA. Today, Dr. Morgan and I are going to discuss the concept of sister cities and specifically the history of the Duluth Sister Cities International organization. As we will discuss further in depth during the course of this interview, sister cities encourage person-to-person exchanges in order to learn more about various communities and cultures. In turn, these activities serve as a means to demystify the other and promote positive conceptualizations of other countries. The grassroots ideals of sister cities serve as an effective soft power tool to engage with communities all around the world. Thus, this fits into the ICRP's broader focus on cultural relations as a tool of diplomacy in international relations. So before we begin our discussion on sister cities, I would like to take a brief moment to formally introduce Professor Morgan. So, Professor Morgan, if you could tell us a little bit more about your academic background and your professional background. In particular, please share with us your areas of specialization and maybe what courses you've taught.
Well, I kind of came in the back door of the academic world, but I've always been interested in journalism, and so I've worked, here in Duluth twice, in fact, for the Duluth News Tribune, the local newspaper, and for one of the local TV stations for a while, but I always had an interest outside of that, and well, one thing led to another, and my path led me through the war in Vietnam, which had a significant impact on me and my thinking about how we should relate to one another on this planet, and I think we should find ways to relate to one another that don't lead to wars. So I came back from Vietnam and decided to study Russian and maybe use that in my journalistic career. And one thing led to another. And the next thing I know, I have a doctorate in Russian literature. And really, what am I going to do with that? Well, I sure didn't want to work for the NSA. I even interviewed for them once, but that was not where I wanted to go. And so I came back to Duluth. And again, worked for the local paper, and one thing led to another. Maybe we can talk about that. And I joined a citizen group that led me to Russia in 1986, and that launched a sister city a relationship between Duluth and a city in Russia, Petrozavodsk, got me to Saint Scholastica. I was recruited to teach there and to start a Russian studies and peace studies program, and have been there for more than 30 years, and still had ties with UMD for a long time too, as well as 20 years, and even have very loose ties still with the newspaper. Occasionally I write articles in the newspaper as well. Is that enough?
Yeah, quite the life journey.
Okay.
All right. So thank you for introducing yourself. And now we'll pivot to a discussion on sister cities. So my first question is, could you tell us exactly what a sister city is? So for example, where did the concept originate from? And what are some of the core ideas behind it?
Well, at the risk of comparing myself to the hero of World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, it does have roots to his experience after, after the defeat of fascist Germany, and as Eisenhower is marching through Europe and sees what this war has wrought, he came to the same conclusion, or I came to the same conclusion that he did, that this was not a good way to do business internationally, and we have to figure out a way to connect with one another that doesn't lead to these awful wars. And so he hosted a big conference in the White House in the mid-50s, and mostly brought in people who weren't connected with the government and asked them to come up with an approach that might be more useful than the traditional approaches, which has always seemed to, in his mind, lead to war. And out of that was the Sister City movement was born. Eisenhower's, I guess, inspiration. And so the movement has continued, and here in Duluth, what it simply means is the officialdom. I think it means different things in different countries and different situations, but here's what it means in Duluth, and I think mostly in the United States, is that the city of Duluth, and that means the mayor ultimately, forms an official relationship with his or her counterpart in another city and declare that they are sister cities. And it requires some sort of, at least in Duluth it does, and I think it does elsewhere, some sort of official city action to declare this.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is, that's nice, and it's nice to have the support of the city administration, but the real on the ground work of maintaining the relationship is in the hands of citizens, not in the hands of the government in most cases. In some cases, in some cases in the United States, there are people in City Hall who are just kind of assigned to be the coordinator and sort of make things happen, do the housekeeping, but the real initiative and the real creativity is in the hands of citizens. It is citizen diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of blessed by the City Hall, which I think is nice. And then we are a part of an international organization of sister cities.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk more about this idea of citizen diplomacy? So, I mean, you discussed how sister city relationships are established, but can you tell us more about how it operates in practice? And can you tell us more about how citizen diplomacy differs from our traditional definition of diplomacy?
Well, yeah, traditionally, diplomats are government officials that represent the interests and the official desires of the government. And we're not trying, in the Sister Cities movement, we are not trying to substitute that or for that. I mean, that will continue to exist. I think it almost has to continue to exist as long as we have a nation state arrangement in global affairs. But in your official capacity, one's hands are tied sometimes. If you're a head of state or a diplomat, it gets complicated because everything you say is public, and sometimes, and everything you say is political. And as human beings, we are more than that. Aristotle said we're political animals, but we're more than that. And we have other relationships and other interests that transcend the political world. And so by having another term for this is kind of track 2 diplomacy, that was in currency a lot, is to form relationships with people in other cultures at other levels, on other tracks. We're not trying to substitute for foreign relations or foreign policy. But we think the general idea is that talking to one another is a good thing, and it helps us cut through stereotypes, and sometimes, I'll use stronger language, expose the lies that governments tell the citizens, their own citizens, about one another, or sometimes the media does as well, even inadvertently. It's simply opening new channels of communication, and it's a way, a kind of grassroots way of recognizing one another's common humanity. And that's, and as a result, it does have a political purpose. It's a peacemaking purpose. And I saw this myself very vividly with regard to Russia, because that was the one that I have been and continue to be the most actively involved in. Because when we started that, before we even had a Sister Cities official relationship, there was a fair amount of criticism exposed here in Duluth publicly about what we were doing, that you can't trust those Russians, they're communists, they're here to overthrow our way of life. We shouldn't be forming these kinds of unofficial relationships with them. They're bad people, et cetera, et cetera. Were denounced in the newspaper and all that stuff with letters to the editor. Well, of course, we didn't pay any attention to those people, and we formed a relationship with Russians in Petrozavodsk, and I was bringing them. This is when I was still at the newspaper, and I was bringing Russians to Duluth and introducing them around, and having them give talks to clubs like the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club. And the next thing you know, I was getting lectures from some of the prominent business people. You know, Tom, you got to understand, these Russians are people just like us, you know, and they have the same interests that we do. They want a safe world for their children, and they want to have security and so forth. And we have to get past, well, I shouldn't let my ego get in the way here, should I? That it's a recognition, it's an aha moment that the Sister Cities movement helped create in Duluth, Minnesota. And that's not going to change foreign policy immediately. It's not going to, you know, there was just a piece in the paper yesterday or today about President Biden's phone call with Putin, and the relationships is still a little icy and frosty. That's not going to change that overnight, but it's going to mitigate it. And it's going to make the leaders, I'll answer for the American leader, I won't answer for the Russian leader. We can influence him. He can't tell us, and not that Biden would, but he can't tell us that these Russian people are all evil and want to see us destroyed, because we know better. We've met the Russians and we have relationships with them, and that's the peacemaking function.
Well, I think that's one of the ideas that I really admire about Sister Cities, is that it provides another frame of reference. Like, as you said, there's kind of the top-down agenda, which comes from the federal government, and it tends to promote its own interests. But as you said, if you have a Sister Cities relationship, you've met people from other countries one-on-one, and that allows you to form a different opinion about the country.
And that is the point. That is the point, and it can be a lot of fun. I mean, because you find people with common interests in another country, and then you form a relationship over that common interest, whether it be chess or playing tennis or building canoes or, you know, any number of things it could be, or music or art or sports or, you know, that's how you form relationships.
Oh, that's a perfect segue into our next question, because we've discussed the conceptual framework of Sister Cities and what the main ideals are of like sister city relationships. But now let's kind of go to the nitty gritty. So let's talk specifically about our wonderful community, Duluth, Minnesota. So could you tell us a little bit more about Duluth in general, and what do you think are some of the most outstanding features of our community?
Of Duluth? You want the city of Duluth? Well, I'm here by choice, so I'm a real patriot of Duluth. You know, when I graduated, when I finished my graduate work, I was casting around, and where do I want to live? And I just decided I want to live in Duluth. And I carved out a life for myself in Duluth. It's a city in the northern part of the United States. It's on the extreme western edge of Lake Superior, arguably the largest freshwater body in the world. We argue about that with the Russians. It's a fairly, I would say, progressive, cosmopolitan city, considering its location. And part of that is because it's an international port. And it's evolved a lot over the years. Today, it's almost a college town. There are, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 institutions of higher education in the city of Duluth, and that represents a significant industry. It's a major medical community for the entire area of northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota and upper Michigan. And it's a big port. And it's a big tourist area for people in the Twin Cities and Chicago and Milwaukee. Those are the four major industries. There's about 85,000 people, give or take, and fairly well educated. We have our own symphony and fairly progressive. And for the most part, it's been fairly, the Sister Cities movement has been received quite positively in Duluth. And I don't know if that would be the case in every city. We have a sister city in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had the Kurds here several times, and they've always been received very, very well and very graciously by the people of Duluth. And that makes me feel good. We're
Yeah.
modeling behavior here in the city of Duluth, what they should be doing at other levels of government.
All right. Well, thank you for telling us a little bit more about Duluth. And then can you tell us exactly what cities Duluth has sister city relationships with, and like what countries those cities are in?
Right. And they all have their own stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're none of us exactly know which was the first one. But I suppose it is known someplace, but an obvious one is Thunder Bay, Canada, which is just about 200 miles up the shore to the east of here on Lake Superior. That's a natural one that we would have some kind of relationship with Canada. And Thunder Bay is a nice pairing for Duluth. Another one is Växjö, Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
Another logical pairing for Duluth, because Duluth is full of Scandinavians and Finns. And so there's a lot of kind of cultural heritage there anyway. This city is a particularly apt one because it calls itself the greenest city in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So they are very, very big on environmental living and sustainable living, and Duluth aims to move in that direction as well. And there's been some cross-fertilization in that regard. The third city is Petrozavodsk. It's in Russia, and it's the one I was involved in. And by the way, there is a long history between Duluth and Petrozavodsk that dips back into the 1930s that I didn't even know about until we started going there. And then we have Izumi City in Japan. There's a story that goes with that one too, and why we have a city with Japan. It wasn't just arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is Rania in Iraqi Kurdistan, and that's a fairly recent one. So we have 5.
All right. Just real quickly, could you tell us more about the history between Izumi City, Japan, and Duluth, Minnesota? Like, what is the story behind that?
Well, at the end of World War II, you know, at the end of any war, soldiers and sailors of wars tend to take trophies. And one of the trophies that some sailors aboard a naval vessel, the USS Duluth, seized was a big bell. That was a kind of the pride and joy of this Izumi city. And they brought it back to the United States and then didn't know what to do with it. So the sailors or the people on that ship, and this is after World War II, they gave it to the city of Duluth. This was back in the early 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the city of Duluth didn't exactly know what to do with it either. And so I believe it was sitting in the basement someplace in City Hall. And for some reason, a Japanese delegation was in Duluth in the mid-1950s. And they saw that bell. And that was their kind of beloved bell that they had thought had melted down. The Japanese were melting down all these sacred bells, you know, for the war effort, and it was still there in Duluth. And told the mayor, I knew that mayor, I worked with him quite a bit at the newspaper. He subsequently worked at the paper, George Johnson, and could we have the bell back? And George Johnson was very gracious. Well, of course you can. And they made a big deal out of it, returning the bell. And the city of the Japanese were so pleased with that and grateful. It was a kind of peace gesture that they cast another bell, a duplicate, and they gave it to the city of Duluth, and that bell is now um, in Anger Park, a park on top of the hill here in Duluth. And the Sister City movement got involved then, and we created a kind of Japanese garden around it, a peace garden, and we still maintain that garden. And the Sister City kind of came along, the Sister City relationship kind of came along in the wake of that, and now it's a thriving relationship. And that one in particular involves a lot of youth exchanges, high school students primarily. And when they dedicated the bell, this was a big, big deal. This was about 10 years ago in Anger Park, and all the mayors were there and former mayors, and it was a major event and a major statement for peacekeeping.
And I mean, this is my own personal opinion, but I think the Peace Garden is one of the most picturesque places to visit in Duluth. So viewers, if you're if you ever come to
Yes.
Duluth,
Sure.
stop by the Peace Garden.
Yeah, it's Anger Park.
Yeah. And can you just give us a few more details about Rania as well and Iraqi Kurdistan?
Well, that one is, depending on who you ask, you'll get a different story. But here's my story. I was teaching a class. I don't know. I guess you never had that class for me, but I developed a class that I've taught for many years on nonviolent resolution of global conflict. And so I would sometimes have people come and speak to the class, and there is a woman in Duluth who has been part of peacemaking organizations in the wake of the war in Iraq, a Christian peacemaker team. She was a part of that and other things. And so I thought, well, I'll invite her to my class and she can talk about that. That was kind of an NGO approach to peacemaking and working with her Arab counterparts. Well, it didn't, in her case, things didn't go so well in Baghdad. It was just too chaotic, but she ended up in Kurdistan and there's a long history there, and sometimes not all so pretty, between the relationships between the Kurds and the Americans, but mostly it was positive for her. And she talked about, to me and to the class, about what an appropriate thing to do for the city of Duluth to have a sister city in the Mideast, which is one of the hotspots now on our planet in terms of threatening war. And she kind of laid down a challenge to me as somebody who was involved in sister cities, and she had a good point. So I went and talked with somebody else that I've been involved in this sort of work, and we accepted her challenge. His name is Brooks Anderson, and I and a couple other people, we went to the town in northern Iraq and Rani, and one thing led to another, and that's how these things start. And then eventually we had a couple of exchanges, and the city was convinced, we convinced the previous mayor, to declare this a sister city. So that was definitely connected with peacemaking.
All right. Well, thank you for your overview of all the sister city relationships. We've touched upon this a little bit, but can you give us more detail as to how Duluth maintains its relationships with its other sister cities? So is it just a symbolic relationship, or what sorts of activities do the two communities?
Well, every city is different. Because the people involved kind of create their own relationship. One of the richest ones, if I dare say so myself, is the one with Russia, and the one I'm involved in. Because of that relationship, I formed, or with others, not just me single-handedly, formed a relationship between the College of Saint Scholastica and the university in Petrozavodsk. And we have been exchanging students for almost 30 years between the two universities in a variety of programming, not just students in each other's universities, but other kinds of activities as well. And with regard to Petrozavodsk, we have had lots of music and art exchanges. We had sculpture exchanges. We had an exchange with Native Americans.
Mm,
There are kind of the equivalent of Native people in Karelia. That's where Petrozavodsk is located, and that's a republic in. Well, Karelia is to Russia what Minnesota is to the United States. Let's just put it this way.
mhm,
And the indigenous people there are Karelians, which are they're an ethnic group very close to the Finns. And
mhm,
guess what? In Karelia, they have birch trees and lakes and rivers, lots of birch trees and lots of water. Well, that creates a culture built on water and birch trees. Well, who else has a culture built on water and birch trees? Ojibwe Indians of Minnesota. And so we got them together, and we had that was pretty exciting. The the uh, the native people went to Petrozavodsk and they built a canoe,
mhm,
and the Karelians came to Minnesota and they built a baidarka, which is sort of their equivalent of a canoe, a small watercraft made of birch bark,
mhm.
designed to traverse lakes and rivers. And so what a wonderful exchange between these two minority peoples. Um, well, maybe that's enough. The big story with Petrozavodsk is that a great number of American communists in the 1930s
Mhm.
immigrated from the Duluth area to Petrozavodsk. So that forms a relationship right there. With Sweden, I mean, there's been several exchanges connected around energy and sustainable living. We have a building in Duluth. We call it the Soft Center, or what do we call it now? The Tech Village
Mhm.
was kind of inspired by a trip that our mayor made to Växjö, Sweden.
Mhm.
And so we continue to do that. We're particularly active with youth soccer. And every year we have a soccer tournament. One year it's in Duluth with Swedes and Americans playing soccer. This is mostly high school. And one year it's in Sweden. Um, well, and so on. We have lots of activities with regard to Thunder Bay, centered around Lake Superior. That's an obvious uh, topic because we're
Mhm.
both on the shores of Lake Superior, and we both bear some responsibility, I think, for the health of that lake, and so on. Is that
All
enough?
right. Yeah, that's perfect. And so we're kind of winding down to the end of our interview, but one key question that I have is, how do you think the core ideas of sister city relationships resonate in our modern day and age? And what are some ways that we can continue these ideals going further and further into the future?
It's hard. I can only speak for Duluth,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm guessing Duluth is a kind of microcosm of the United States. Right now, there are so many problems facing us immediately,
Mm-hmm.
right in front of us. And we all know what they are, connected with the pandemic, connected with racial justice, connected with the economy. Um, and these are real problems that we all have to face. There are just problems that we all have to face in our cities, paying for the schools and keeping the streets up and all the rest of that. So it is very easy for the Sister City movement to sort of be forgotten or not command the kind of attention that, of course, I think it should have. It's easy to see that pushed by in favor of other more pressing issues. So the problem is, most people that I deal with think it's a grand idea. Of course, we should be friends and talk to people, on the other side of the planet, and of course, we should be doing these things. But we got to get the potholes fixed, and we have to get more teachers in our schools, and we have to deal with racism in America, and we have to fix the pandemic. So it kind of gets forgotten sometimes or
Mm-hmm.
overlooked, especially when there isn't a pressing international crisis. When Russia was the evil empire,
Mm-hmm.
That's what Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union, and was seen as a huge threat. That was actually good for Sister Cities business. But now that it doesn't seem as big a threat, sometimes people are overlooking that. And I don't mean just Russia, but I mean just in general, the whole Sister Cities movement. So is to keep people's vision, that's the biggest challenge, is to keep people's visions outside their own borders, their own county limits. And that's not easy to do.
Yeah. But I like earlier when you were discussing Duluth's Tech Village and the fact that it was inspired by Växjö, Sweden, I think it's very important to maintain these relationships because they might offer alternative ideas and solutions on how to better our own communities.
Of
That's the thing.
course.
Yeah. I mean, of course, yes, you want to make sure that you're addressing your home community's like main issues, but inspiration can come from having a broader vision and
Yes.
connecting with other cities around the world.
Tell that to people when you're asking them for money.
Okay.
I mean, that's the problem. You see, of course you're right. And I agree with you, but it's a kind of an abstract idea and it's a long-term thinking. And so immediate crises sometimes crowd us out.
Yeah.
But of course you're right.
Yeah. So it just seems, it kind of seems like the main idea that you have is to try to have that broader vision, both in terms of, thinking outside the borders of Duluth, but also in terms of like time as well. Just what could be the long-term benefits of having these relationships.
And generally speaking, politicians in the general public, that's not our long suit, right? That's not what we're good at, thinking long term. It's always an immediate crisis, isn't it? So that's the challenge.
Yeah.
For the whole organization.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was wondering if you had any other concluding remarks or anything else that you'd like to say.
It's enriched my life being involved in it. It got me a job at Saint Scholastica. And when this started, when my part of it started with Russia, it started because I was approached by a man here in Duluth, his name is Brooks Anderson, with this idea of reaching out to Russians. And he approached me because he knew I could speak Russian and I was somewhat knowledgeable. And at least twice, I set him down gently and said, this is unrealistic. This is not going to happen. We're not going to end the Cold War here in Duluth, Minnesota. And he was persistent. He kept at me. And as a result, I got very involved. And the lesson to that is sometimes you pay attention to the dreamers. Sometimes you pay attention to the idealists, because sometimes things work out. In that case, it did.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and thank you for the interview, Professor Morgan.
Sure.
And I think it was a wonderful opportunity for all of us to learn more about sister city relationships and how they can form friendships all over the world, and despite the challenges, how they can be an effective tool for promoting international peace.
Okay. Thank you for having me.